Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Assange, why is he still locked up and what happens now? Organised by Cheshire and Greater Manchester Stop the War Coalition. I'm Chris Rees, convener of the Greater Manchester Group. And this, and I say this, not turning to my left or my right, but you can see here on the screen is Helen Rutherford-Gregory, who's chair of Cheshire Stop the War, and we've co-organised and hosted this event. The meeting is part of an international campaign in support of Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, and somebody who has paid a very high price indeed for revealing to the world the crimes of US imperialism, particularly through the release of the Iraqi war logs. And he has been in Belmarsh prison in London since 2019. On the 6th of January this year, Judge Vanessa Beritz ruled that Julian Assange should not be extradited to the United States on the grounds that the brutality of the US prison system will put him at risk of suicide. A ruling against extradition was, of course, what Julian and his campaign were hoping for, but satisfaction was tempered somewhat by the judge's refusal both to concede the injustice of the case against him and grant him bail. So, with a US appeal looming and Julian Assange still in Belmarsh prison, his campaign enters another critical phase. And our expert panel this afternoon will set out the challenges facing the campaign and explain what we can all do to ensure that Julian Assange walks out of Belmarsh prison a free man as soon as possible so that he can be reunited with his partner and children. Each of our speakers will talk for around 10 minutes. And if you have a question you would like to put to any of them, please use the question and answer function and we'll deal with them at points throughout the meeting. And I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker today, Apsana Begum, who is Member of Parliament for Poplar and Limehouse. Welcome, Apsana.
Thank you so much, Chris, and it's a pleasure to step outside of London and join Mancunians this afternoon. And I just want to start by sort of acknowledging the fact that actually, back in 2003, there were protests against the Iraq War led by Mancunians in Manchester. And I look back then, and it was in 2003, I was 13 years old and marched against the Iraq War in London. And I want to sort of provide a bit of context as to why I feel really strongly about the case of Assange, and also, why this is so important for all of us to continue and keep up the fight, the campaign, and then the struggle to ensure that he's freed. Because his case represents so much in terms of the fight for human rights, the fight for press freedom as well. The Iraq War destroyed so many people and so many lives across Iraq, but it also caused destruction and devastated communities like ones in East London, in Manchester as well. And the consequences of that war are still felt now. When the videos that were released, when the logs were released, there was so much evidence that confirmed to so many of us what we knew then, but it really brought it to light, and it really was able to help us inform our government that what they did in our name was incredibly wrong, morally and legally as well. And those actions really showed the need to preserve press freedom, but also really highlighted the threats posed by the press and the free press to the American British states. And we've got to acknowledge, and we have to keep acknowledging the fact that our state's actions abroad have helped foster the climate of the hostile environment at home. But as an MP that was elected in 2019, I've seen a number of bills, a number of pieces of legislation passed through government, which is whittling down on human rights and is stripping away the very freedoms that we hold really dear. From the Spy Cops Bill, which gives impunity to crimes for security services abroad, to the Overseas Operations Bill, which gives impunity for crimes abroad, and the Spy Cops impunity for security services here at home. So it's really hard not to understand the latest development itself of the Assange case as another iteration of the expansion of international state suppression of people and the criminalization of journalism as well. We're really stronger when we stand up for rights here and when we say our state will respect fundamental rights. but our government is opposing this every step of the way politically. And we can see the number of injustices taking place under the government with the laws that are being passed. Now, in terms of the case of Julian Assange and the latest development where the Biden administration have decided to appeal against the decision not to extradite, I think for us it does bring about a few areas that I think we need to really concentrate ourselves on as part of the campaign. And certainly ourselves, those of us who are MPs, to keep building a coalition of support around Julian and the case. Partly, I think, because there is now greater support than there was previously. There definitely have been shifts with this case. And I think, if you look at even US media outlets, those that were incredibly critical of him personally, of him professionally in the work of journalism, when the verdict came out, they were speaking out. I mean, previously they'd been very critical of WikiLeaks and the work of Julian, did come out to say that this was a decision that shouldn't have been made. So I think, and we've seen in the last few days as well, the international letter signed by Amnesty International and a number of global organizations which protect the rights of journalists. And I think those are really important sort of markers in terms of really understanding that this isn't just, a case of somebody who takes maybe political or took particular actions which are seen to be, aggressive towards particular states, but actually we're looking at the work of journalism here, and we're looking at somebody's human rights, somebody who's paid a really heavy price, and somebody who deserves basic human dignity and respect. And I think for us as MPs, I mean, just to kind of touch upon the work that's being done, when we did try to table a few things in Parliament, but just only because of the fact of the case being, running at the same time. There are some restrictions in terms of what can be tabled in Parliament. Nonetheless, what we are pushing for is, as a group of MPs, some of us have been pushing for trying to see Julian Assange, so trying to meet Julian Assange, to understand his condition and to bring that to light even further. He is an on-remand prisoner. He has rights, and he is yet in a supermax prison in really poor conditions. And I think it's really important for us as MPs to try and bring his condition to light as well, and to really keep pressing on the impact that his ongoing imprisonment has on his mental health, which is what has been cited by the judge as a reason not to extradite him. I think the second thing is to more broadly to keep up a discussion and dialogue around the US-UK extradition treaty. It is highly imbalanced, and the Act gives authority for the Home Secretary to sign off on extraditions themselves. It's a really bad treaty. It was negotiated in secret by Tony Blair's Labour government. It was debated and rushed through, and there were objections from all sides of the House at the time. It was the reason why it was fast-tracked was to allow for the fast-track processing of potential terrorists after 9/11, and that's exactly how it's been used. But the proof of the imbalance is in the numbers. So since 2007, the UK has surrendered 135 UK nationals to the US. 99 of which were for non-violent crimes. That's essentially handing over people to some of the worst prisons in the world. Essentially, and the US in turn has only surrendered 11 to the UK. So that itself shows just how it's underpinned, by an unfair system. And we're slightly past that maybe with this case because the extradition has been rejected, but it also just highlights how important it was to get past that stage as well. I think the other point is actually, politically to keep up the pressure. And I think Niels Meiser, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, who has spoken out about this case, one of the things that he has said is that this case is more likely to be resolved by politics, than the legal elements, unfortunately. And I think it's really important to keep up the political pressure for that reason as well. And there are politicians in the US of different political leanings that are looking at, or have been looking at, things like the Espionage Act in the US, and whether those pieces of legislation need review. And I think there needs to be a coalition of MPs across the world, actually, to try and look at these laws in these areas and how they are imbalanced and how they manifest themselves in different countries. And I think that's also an area for some of us as MPs to take away. But I do think there are obviously certain stages we've passed when it comes to this case, but this appeal and this battle of appeal could last something like 2 years potentially. And I think it's really important to, one, keep focusing on the fact of the physical and mental health impact of this on-remand prisoner who should not be in a supermax prison. And I think the second is the political pressure that needs to be kept up as well. I'm going to stop there, and I know that there'll be opportunities to take questions, and I'm happy to answer those at that point as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Apsana. It was absolutely brilliant. And that message about the importance of keeping up the campaign, the political aspect to it, is absolutely critical and gives us all a clear direction. So very much for that. And I'd like to introduce now our next speaker, who is a member of Greater Manchester Stop the War Coalition, has also spoken previously at Assange campaign rallies. Will you please welcome Lucy Nichols?
Hi, thanks for having me. It's great to hear from Apsana as well, and intimidating to follow an MP, but I'll do my best. I wanted to talk a bit today, a little bit about Julian Assange and his trial, and why we need to support him and show him our full solidarity, in his horrible legal battle that he's up against. I would say that the story of Julian Assange is a bit of a David and Goliath one. It's a battle of one man and his many supporters against some hugely powerful states, with both sides having quite a lot to lose. And it's been a really long, drawn-out battle since Assange has been locked up in some shape or form since 2012, which is when he entered the Ecuadorian embassy in London for the first time. And now he's in Belmarsh, the infamous South London prison, which is where he's been since April 2019, I think. So really for the best part of 2 years. And as Apsana was saying, Belmarsh is just a completely awful place. There's no such thing really as a humane prison, but I would say that Belmarsh is particularly horrible. And I imagine that Belmarsh in the middle of a pandemic is far, far worse, especially given the restrictions placed on the people in the prison under the new COVID legislation, around seeing family. I know for a long time Julian couldn't even see his lawyers and that kind of thing. So his extradition trial, Julian's extradition trial, started last year in 2020, and I would say it's been just inherently political, with the United States essentially taking on press freedom in order to punish the man who exposed a litany of war crimes and scandals and lies. But it is hugely important that so far Assange won't be extradited. And although his extradition has been blocked due to a number of factors, but also largely helped by the huge international campaign of support against him, we've still got a long way to go, and we're certainly not in Italy yet, unfortunately. The judge's refusal of bail at the beginning of the year, based on her belief that he was some kind of flight risk or something, was just a completely cruel decision, especially given Assange's mental and physical health and the living conditions inside Belmarsh. She said it was a matter of fairness that the US should be able to appeal her decision. I think that perhaps maybe her understanding of the word fair is a little bit skewed here, because if we're going by what is really fair, Assange wouldn't have had to seek refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy in the first place, and would certainly not be facing extradition to the US on charges of espionage and so on. But unfortunately, when you bring US and Western imperialism and neoliberalism into play, I think all fairness just goes completely out the window, and morals are replaced by greed and a hunger for war. And really, this is what Julian Assange has exposed with WikiLeaks. I think he, as all journalists should do and do, he acted purely in the public interest by exposing the war crimes and corruption and overall cruelty of particularly the US government. He also brought to light the many evils of various, powerful global institutions, and I think demonstrated to the world how big money and big oil and big whatever was destroying everything from the environment to the lives of individuals in war-torn countries like Afghanistan or Iraq. So it's not surprising, but it is desperately frustrating that the US and UK governments have punished Assange in the way they have, through physical imprisonment, mental torture, to a very serious smear campaign against him. I think Assange's well-being and reputation have been near enough totally eradicated, and I think the governments of the US and the UK and the press will do anything to discredit the man who stood up to those in power. And I'd say that the campaign against Assange has been a very serious one, not just a legal battle, but one through the press and the mainstream media. I think the governments have used the press to stop him from becoming a likeable character so that he isn't viewed as a hero or a martyr or anything like that. Because if he was, there would be a public outcry, because people might start to think that the people who commit war crimes are worse than the people who expose them. So they've worked really hard over the last decade or so to completely destroy his reputation, without outlets like the Daily Mail painting him and his supporters as loony, over the top lefties. I think the case of Vivienne Westwood sort of springs to mind here, and the horrible things that were published about her. And I don't think this isn't a new thing. I think after a few years of Corbynism, it's quite obvious what the media will do to persuade you that people like Corbyn or like Assange are dangerous, when really they're just working in the interest of the public and not the establishment. And these media claims are often just completely ridiculous and contradictory and irrational. Jeremy Corbyn is somehow both a Birkenstock-wearing hippie and a terrorist sympathiser, and Julian Assange is somehow both a crazy intelligent computer hacker and just a weird old guy. But the truth is that Assange is very, very dangerous, a very dangerous man to the US and the UK as we know them. And what he did expose did serious damage, especially given the sort of already unpopularity of, for example, the war on terror in the first place. And I think this is exactly why we have to support him and campaign for his immediate release, because the US government is absolutely not interested in the well-being of any of us, not even under the lovely new Liberal administration we've got with Biden and Harris, who are still fighting to get Assange extradited anyway. And we mustn't forget that, of course, WikiLeaks sort of came out for the first time in 2009, and that was under the Obama administration when Biden was the vice president. I think any court case against Assange is absolutely not for the people and will not do a single thing to improve any of our lives, but will instead, of course, set a very worrying precedent for journalistic freedoms and human rights the world over. It is Assange who fought in our interests by taking on these states that continue to oppress not only the people who, like us, who live under them, but the people all over the Middle East and the global South as a whole. I think WikiLeaks did a lot to expose the true evils of Western imperialism and war, and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan especially, led to unspeakable cruelties against the people in the Middle East, and state-sanctioned war crimes took place, and the people responsible have largely got away with it, while in a complete perversion of justice, it's the whistleblowers and journalists that have been punished for exposing these, war crimes, amongst other things. So I would say that, if you do anything today, join Stop the War in calling for an end to the horrific treatment of Julian Assange and in fighting for his immediate release. And I don't think this is about just one man, although clearly it is. Assange does need to be released on the basis that he's not really done anything wrong, and of course the cruelty that's been he's been subjected to. But it's also about journalistic freedom and freedom of the press to take on the powerful and work in the public interest. And it's also about holding these warmongering states like the one we live in to account. The various imperialist projects in the Middle East from the West have all been abject failures. The British, European and American states will of course try and argue against this. So when people like Julian Assange show up and show the world the skeletons in their closet, these governments aren't overly impressed, which is why we have to support the campaign against extradition and call for his release from prison and demonstrate our unwavering solidarity with him.
Thank you so much for that, Lucy. What a brilliant contribution. You've done some brilliant work recently for Stop the War, and I really admire you as an activist. So as earlier Chris introduced me, but you might not have seen me, I'm Helen Rutherford-Gregory, and I am from Cheshire, Stop the War, and we've organised this event in conjunction with Manchester. So our next speaker today is going to be Lauri, who is a hacker, an activist and a computer scientist. I'm sure you read about his case in the news, and if not, he's here and he's going to talk to us a little bit about his experience with the Assange case. Thanks, Lauri.
Hello, hi, can you hear me, guys? Give me a little wave if you can.
Perfectly.
Yeah, so it's very, very nice to be with all. I'm very honoured for you to invite me to this panel to discuss what's a very important situation as far as I'm concerned personally, and as far as the world is concerned, or at least as was so eloquently explained by a comrade previously, Lucy, as far as our principles and standards for the kind of world that we'd like to live in are concerned. And for those who don't know, I've been there, done that, and got the t-shirt, not this t-shirt, but they didn't actually give you a t-shirt for winning extradition against the United States, which is a bit of a shame, but they pay my legal costs, so I suppose that's almost worth a t-shirt. But yeah, the US did try to extradite me in somewhat similar circumstances under a similar statute, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, for allegedly being involved in a hacktivist campaign after the tragic death of Aaron Swartz, who's someone who's worth looking up. He's an internet wunderkind who was harassed to death, basically harangued to suicide by an overzealous prosecutor in the US for indirectly because of his work for information transparency and his assumed association with WikiLeaks and people of that nature. We won. We successfully appealed extradition, mainly on the basis, similarly to Julian's decision just now in Westminster Magistrates Court, that it would be, the phrasing is very important, unjust and oppressive to put someone with physical and mental health conditions into the inhumane US prison detention system, the jail and prison system, and the conditions within them being so horrific. And this was exacerbated by the disparity in sentencing. So I was accused of some shenanigans, shall we say. A few websites got changed to spread a political message, and I was facing 99 years in prison. Julian is facing even more, which, you know, when we think about it for a second, is an absurdity in itself, because he's not going to live another 124 years or however many it is, and I wasn't going to live 99 years. So already, you know, just those numbers establish that the so-called justice regime in the United States tends towards ludicrous sentences, even for non-violent alleged offences, such as we're speaking of. But I just want to speak a bit to, I guess, on a personal level, as to what it's like to be in this situation. The exact situation is a country that you haven't spent much time in or have never visited, in my case, is very upset at some things that you did outside of their country and would like to take you there and lock you up for the rest of your life, to send a message to other people that power should not be held to account, or you should not have truth spoken to it, or should not be agitated towards acting better. And it's not a pleasant process. It wasn't pleasant for me, and I had the amazing benefit of being on bail, so I was able to be somewhat free. I was under house arrest, but I wasn't in a maximum security prison under almost as unpleasant conditions as the United States. And even then, I had to deal with a severe degradation in my physical and mental well-being, especially in this period that we're in now, which was in between the initial verdict and the appeal. Now, in my case, we lost in Westminster Magistrates. I should say, for the benefit of people that aren't, who have the luxury of not being United States extradition law hobbyists, most people do historically lose in the first instance, and if you're going to not get extradited to the United States, it will be on appeal. So Julian's been lucky in that he managed to win in this first instance, but he's still being dragged through the appeals process because the United States very much wants to get their man. But it's exactly in this process that it became most dire, because you're still faced with this uncertainty on your shoulders every day, wondering, will I get to spend the rest of my life with my family, my children, continuing to provide hopefully useful contributions to the world, or will I exist within the very small four walls of a concrete cell, being mistreated until I wither away and die, and exist solely to deter people. And Julian will be going through that right now, and I think it's important that we remember that this is about two things, and one is the very important principles that stand behind the case, but it's also a personal story that I would like to think, kinds of people that are participating and watching this panel do not believe that humans should be caged like animals, and certainly do not believe humans should be caged like animals for standing up to power and trying to bring about a better world through transparency. And so I guess the other bit of useful experience that I can talk about is the reasons that we won again. It was, in my case, it was on two grounds. So the legalese, two grounds for refusing the extradition. One was what's called the forum bar, which was introduced after the case of Gary McKinnon, who was another young, curious hacker who had no particular malicious intent, who embarrassed the US government because of their lack of security. And they tried to extradite him again, lock him up for a ridiculous amount of time. And that was eventually stopped by Theresa May, ex-Prime Minister. You might possibly remember, in the one good political act, in my opinion, of her life, of her career. And after Gary's extradition was stopped, they introduced the forum bar, and this was kind of a fig leaf in exchange for taking away the discretion of the Home Secretary to refuse extradition on human rights grounds. And I'll just say that again slowly. The Home Secretary, the final authority on whether someone is extradited to another country, is by law that the Conservative government brought in, not allowed to consider the implications for human rights when rubber stamping an extradition request. And I think that's atrocious in itself. I don't think the government can bind its own hands from considering the human rights implications of its decisions, but that's where we are. So in return for taking away that check and balance, they introduced the forum bar, which simply says if it's in the interest of justice for there to be a domestic prosecution rather than an extradition, then that's what should happen, which is pretty common sense when you consider that extradition historically came about because people would commit crimes and then flee a country to avoid the consequences of their crimes, or at least avoid a trial. And this is not the case when the United States is attempting to exert extrajudicial authority, or exorbitant authority is the legal term. But all that means is they're trying to say our laws apply everywhere around the world, which is a completely unilateral situation. You won't get the government of Zimbabwe or Papua New Guinea attempting to extradite people for financial accusations or computer crimes. It's only the United States that feels that it has the power to push its authority and its system of justice onto the whole world. And so we won because it was deemed to be in the interest of justice not to send someone to a country they've never been to be prosecuted under dubious conditions of trial and even worse conditions of detention. And this is the last thing I want to mention on the legal front, difference between the UK and the United States, or any other legal regime really, where someone might be prosecuted for a computer-related offence, and that is the plea bargaining system. So the problem in the United States, in terms of federal criminal justice, is that 97% of people do not have their day in court, which might come as a surprise to some of you, but out of 100 people, 97 people plead guilty. And the reason they do this, some of them because they feel guilty, but the majority of them is because they're bullied, strong-armed into it. And the technical term is a coercive plea bargaining system. You're coerced into taking the guilty plea because then the sentences that are the charges that are pressed against you by the prosecutors go down from, in my case, 99 years to say a decade or two. And it's just a question of odds. Do you want to roll that dice in a stacked court and risk the entire rest of your life, or do you want to take away, relinquish your right to a fair trial and accept the lower deal? And it's not the way that we do justice here in the UK or in most other systems. So I'll maybe just take some questions now or something to stop me rambling too much.
Yeah, we have actually had a question for you, Lauri, so I'm just going to grab that for you. Deeper Driver has said, Lauri, would you be able to speak to what contributions WikiLeaks and Julian have made to the ecosystem of whistleblowing by harnessing technology to journalism?
Absolutely. So it's, I mean, how much time do you have? Let me try and be concise. I'm good at talking fast. So I would say that WikiLeaks completely changed the model of journalism, reinvigorated it, I should say, because the problem, try to avoid using too much technical terminology, but the problem with mainstream media is that in order to remain in the mainstream media, you have to cultivate relationships with power. And in an ideal world, we consider the media to be in an adversarial relationship to power. So you think the White House press correspondents, they're asking difficult questions and trying to cause trouble, trying to get the policies explained in such a way that it's not just PR. But what they don't tell you is, you know, in order to get access, in order to get those interviews, in order to get those quotes from those sources that are often not identified when it comes to government policy, you've got to play by the rules. And so even, try not to have too much of a vendetta, but say imagine a sort of left-leaning publication that sometimes is right on, and then strangely takes a very national security aligned policy with regard to certain stories, and decides to be complicit in the vilification of someone like Julian, again not naming names. The reason they do that is because people, the relationship to power is such that it can become harder to do your job if you upset the wrong people. Rather than going down that route, and rather than editorializing and leaving important facts on the cutting room floor, as the analogy goes, the things that don't make it into print or don't make it onto the online or don't make it onto the news clip, WikiLeaks decided to come up with a new model, and that is to trust the public enough to give them direct access to authenticated, verified, original source documentation. So we will not tell you the story, we will not editorialize, we'll not put a spin on it that's consistent with our slant or consistent with our requirements to stay pally with the government or the D-Notice committee. We will just give you the truth, the unvarnished truth, and that was really revolutionary. And even though WikiLeaks itself has been punished, marginalized, Julian has been vilified, that model that the public should be empowered to contribute as a whistleblower, that you should be able to do this in a way that through technology you have some assurance of safety. So the main thing with that is source protection, because we know, let's take a very poignant recent example, the Panama Papers, the journalist who revealed that, who was from Malta, was murdered in a car bomb. And there are many organizations within which, if you were to blow the whistle, you could expect horrific personal repercussions. And so WikiLeaks, with the help of technology developed by Aaron Swartz, created a system where sources could have a reasonably strong assurance of anonymity, and the publisher, if it could avoid it, the publisher themselves would not know who the source is. And even mainstream press outlets use the evolution of this technology. It's called Secure Drop. Anyone can run it and upload documents through Tor, through this secure network, and to blow the whistle. But if you do that to the Washington Post, again, not to vilify them particularly over anyone else, you're still trusting that their editors, their journalists will do with that material what you would want. They would expose it in a way that feels right to your interest in blowing the whistle. WikiLeaks took away that intermediation, that standing in between the truth and the public and saying this is the story that we want to tell you. It gave access to the public. You can go to the WikiLeaks website today and you can search hundreds of thousands of diplomatic cables. You can search the war logs from Iraq and Afghanistan. You can search troves of materials that are all indexed and searchable from thousands of other dumps, revelations, and it's for the people themselves as a crowd to pull out the important bits of truth and to tell the story themselves. And I think that contribution is vital. And I think without that having happened, especially in the context of the collateral murder video and the footage from the Apache war helicopter shooting Reuters journalists and civilians in Iraq, that changed the sentiment of people towards those wars, voluntary wars of aggression, those not necessary wars, those elective wars, and really helped galvanize the anti-war movement in 2008, 2009. And we still need that today. People today are not aware of some of the undeclared conflicts. There's the Biden administration, I'm sad to say, has already begun bombing in Somalia. I'm sure there are many other places that we simply haven't heard of. So the need for outlets like WikiLeaks, the need for that model where we get the truth. We do not decide what the public should know. We do not take this paternalistic attitude, but we just entrust the public with access to the documents and allow them to tell the story for themselves is more vital than ever, I'd say.
Thank you so much for that, Lauri. That was an excellent contribution. I'm glad we took that question because your answer that was brilliant. So our next speaker today is going to be John Rees, and John Rees has been an absolute whirlwind of support for Julian Assange, and John's running the Don't Extradite Assange campaign, and if you look in the chat you'll see there's a link to that campaign there. Check out that website because it is very, very important, and there's lots of instructions about actions you can take on that website. So thank you, John. Over to you.
Thanks, Helen, and thanks to the other panelists for their contributions. I just want to start here, really. The Assange case, of course, has been going on for more than a decade, if you include the time that he spent in the Ecuadorian embassy and the 2 years almost that he's been in Belmarsh prison alone. And there's a complex of accusations and stories and material all swirling around the name Julian Assange. And what I want to do first of all is to suggest to you that it's best really to clear the decks of that, to put all that aside for a moment and simply consider the issue that is on the table before us now, and that's contained in the American charges filed with the British courts, for which he will be extradited if the Americans win the appeal that they've lodged. And those accusations brought under the 1917 US Espionage Act. That's the first time ever that an Espionage Act, that Espionage Act has been used against journalists. Those 18 charges are very, very clear. They are simply and only about the Iraq war logs, the Afghan war logs, the Guantanamo Bay files, and the diplomatic cables. They're about no other issue. So the United States is abundantly clear that what it wishes to charge Julian Assange for, and if he were charged in the United States and found guilty, he could find himself in jail for, well, as Lauri has said, the ridiculous sum of 175 years. In other words, what the United States is saying is that you'll die in jail. And the charges for which he would die in jail are about and only about the Iraq war, the Afghan war, Guantanamo, and Cablegate. So the issue before us is therefore simplified. In fact, the issue is blindingly simple. If you think that you have the right to know what your government and the United States government is doing with your tax dollars and your tax pounds, if you think you have the right to know what is happening to the lives of your fellow citizens in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Guantanamo Bay, or the actions of the diplomats around the world whose wages you pay, then you're on the side of Julian Assange. If, on the other hand, you think that governments or corporations have the right to take your money, indeed to take your citizens' lives, and not tell you why they're doing so, or for what purposes they're acting, or in what ways they're behaving, then you don't have to support Julian Assange. But the overwhelming majority of people in this country think that they do have that right, that they do have the right to know why and how a government is doing things. And I'm not talking about small things. I'm not talking about changing the one-way system around your town, although people get hot under the collar about that as well. I'm not talking about changing the street furniture down your road. I'm talking about matters of war and peace. I'm talking about the spending of billions of pounds. I'm talking about incarcerating people without trial. If you think you have the right to know about those world-changing events, then you're a supporter of Julian Assange and an opponent of him being extradited to the United States. It's as simple as that. I just want to talk a little bit now about where we are in that process, because as I say, it's been a long train coming, and hard, I think, sometimes for activists who've been engaged in that struggle over that time to kind of recalibrate where we are. Because the truth of the matter is, we are now at the decisive moment. We had in January a decision by Westminster Magistrates Court that Julian should not be extradited. Now, it was a bittersweet decision because it was a decision taken simply and solely on the basis, as other panelists have said, that the US prison system is too brutal, too oppressive for somebody in Julian's frame of mind to be put into it. I'd say it's pretty much too brutal for anybody in any state of mind to be put into it, but whatever. The judge ruled that that was the case. Unfortunately, she also ruled that there was no public interest self-defense for publishing the information that Julian did, no right for the public to know, no protection for journalists who were trying to expose what their governments were up to. So it was simultaneously a victory for Julian and a very dangerous decision for the freedom of the press. If, when the Americans appeal, as they are intending to do, in the next few weeks or months, the extradition is reactivated, if they win that case, then not only will Julian be in peril, but everything else about this case will look vindicated. In other words, it won't just be him that's in peril. It will be every journalist, every whistleblower, and the right of every citizen to know what's going on in their society, which will be imperiled along with him. So now is the moment for us all to step up the campaigning. We cannot afford for the quashing of that extradition request to be reversed in the appeal courts. Now, as any lawyer worth their salt, Gareth Pearce, who's an extraordinarily experienced lawyer, Clive Stafford Smith, also an extremely experienced lawyer, made this point in court. Every court case is won, or certainly political court cases like this, are won 50% in court and 50% in the court of public opinion. It matters what the surrounding political atmosphere is. Don't believe this nonsense that judges aren't affected by it. They're deeply affected by it. They are connected by 1,000 threads to the political establishment. They receive the messages. They get the idea. They pick up the atmosphere. Their casual conversations with people from their own class inform them about what the best result for the wider political establishment is. They make political decisions. Their rulings are always political. So that's the good news, as a matter of fact. It shouldn't be how it is, but it is good news because it means we can affect the political atmosphere. What we do can change the environment in which this decision will be made in the appeal court. So every great movement, this was true of the Stop the War movement, it's true of the anti-austerity movement, it's true of the labour and trade union movement. Every movement is a mosaic of small acts. Never believe that what you personally do is too small or too irrelevant to count. It isn't, because aggregated, when we all do it, it makes an enormous change in the political atmosphere. So if all you can do is repost this video, or take something from the DEA website and repost it on Facebook or Twitter or other social media, do that. If you can write to your local paper or the national papers, do that. If you can raise the resolution that's now gone through the National Union of Journalists, Unite the Union, the National Education Union, the Train Drivers Union ASLEF, if you can take that resolution, it's on the DEA website, and pass it through your trade union, do that. Or your Labour Party, do that. If you can sign a petition and pass it around, do that. If you can talk to your friends, your family, your workmates, people in your church or your mosque, do that. It's all these things together that make a mass movement possible. When we can protest either online or in 3D again, let's do that, because this is what changes the political atmosphere, and it's working. The political atmosphere around this case in the last 18 months has been transformed. There's no doubt about this. When I was able to visit Julian in Belmarsh before COVID, he made this point absolutely explicitly on 2 separate occasions. He said, do not talk as if we are a tiny, embattled minority. We are not. Amnesty International supports this, and 40 other NGOs. Every single serious civil rights NGO in the world supports this case. As I said, major trade unions support this case. Apsana and her allies in Parliament support this case. For heaven's sake, even the editorial line of the Daily Telegraph, of the Daily Mail, is in favour of Julian Assange not being extradited. This is a case in which the tide has turned, in which we have a victory. We have now to defend that victory and ensure that it's not reversed. But we are winning the battle of public opinion, and it's only changed because ordinary people have stuck to it. The Daily Telegraph didn't suddenly wake up one day and decide to defend journalism. If nobody else had been kicking up about this, if nobody else had been protesting about this, they would have let it slide and wouldn't have looked at it twice. But because ordinary people got organised and started pressurising the political system, it's got a response out of that system. Let's keep going, let's keep fighting, and let's make sure that within the next few months, Julian Assange walks free from Belmarsh prison.
John, thank you so much for that. It's absolutely inspirational. You've played a really critical role in this campaign, so thanks for everything you've done and for sharing that today. We've got time for a few questions, and I'm going to address the first one to Apsana. It's 2 questions combined into one. They sit well together. It's this, Apsana: what support is there in Parliament for Julian Assange, and have MPs managed to speak to him? And specifically, Richard Bergen requested an online meeting with him last December. Did this happen, to the best of your knowledge?
Thanks so much for those questions. I mean, I think the first thing is, would you believe there are even some Tory MPs who actually feel strongly on the points of civil liberties and have therefore been also speaking out about the case. And I think that just goes on from what John was just saying about the shift in this case and the issues around press freedom being so key here. The letter to Robert Buckland, the Justice Secretary, went in December before the verdict was announced, and that was one way to put on pressure. And we haven't actually had a video meeting with Julian Assange. We've not heard back, to the best of my knowledge, but I do think that we should and we will go back to that and try and make sure it happens, especially in light of the fact that the verdict itself talked about Julian's mental health and his physical health. And I think we are really pressing on the points around the fact that he's an on-remand prisoner, shouldn't be in Belmarsh prison. The conditions that he's in need to change. So I think in light of the fact that the judge herself spoke about mental health as one of the reasons, means, you know, it's not gonna technically improve, is it, if you're still in jail in this country in these really bad conditions. I picked up the second question around, you know, what are the political ways, or what are the political people who need to be pressured? I do think there needs to be a way in which American politicians should be also campaigned and lobbied. And I think that's really important. If we look at the officials that submitted this appeal itself, I mean, because of the timing, it was done by an acting Attorney General. And, you know, there were definitely lots of deliberations that happened under the Obama administration, under the Attorney General Eric Holder at that time. And in the end, they didn't prosecute Julian, and they didn't charge him with a crime. And I think, you know, we're looking at a very similar administration politically here. And I think there needs to be as much pressure applied to American politicians at all levels as well, particularly Congress people and senators. And I think that's what I meant earlier when I said that this issue, this case is going to be part resolved by politics, and the political pressure is really important to build.
Thanks for that, Apsana. We've got a question here for Lucy. Deepa asks, Lucy, could you give us some thoughts on how we can take the movement to free Julian to more student organisations and unions?
Yeah, I can definitely speak about student stuff. I think first of all, we've got a very strong student and youth Stop the War group who do special student events for students and young people, so not just people in universities but people in sixth forms, and we have had quite a few meetings on Assange that have done fairly well. So first, if you're a student, I would definitely suggest getting involved in student and youth Stop the War. And then in terms of bringing it to sort of individual universities, I think John was talking earlier about getting a resolution passed. And I would say absolutely, if you can get a resolution passed through in your, you know, your student society, whether that's a student Labour Society or Palestine SOC or Stop the War SOC, whatever it may be, or even in your student union, certainly try and get that done. I know that student unions across the country, especially my student union, has committed to divestment from Israel. So it's not like it's completely, student unions are completely, opposed to leftist or anti-war politics. So I would definitely suggest doing that. And then in terms of more grassroots things, I think if there's one thing students are good at the minute, it is grassroots organisation and getting mobilised. I would definitely suggest, if you feel obliged, set up a protest when it's possible. There will no doubt be things to protest about Julian Assange, and when it's possible, we should be taking to the streets and supporting him, or for the time being, just putting on, meetings, local meetings, aimed at students, by students and for students. And I know that there's Stop the War groups around the country and various student Stop the War groups who would be more than happy to support, whoever wants to do a meeting, in support of Assange and that kind of thing. So I think there's quite a few options, and I think students are very happy to get organised. And then finally, of course, as a UCU, if students are organising in universities and lecturers as well, should do as well. And I would encourage, if you're in the UCU, if you're a student and you have ties to your UCU, local UCU members, try and get a resolution passed in the UCU branch as well.
Great, thank you, Lucy. And just setting out, as you and others have done, the sheer range of organisations, campaigns and bodies that are supporting this, it just gives us such hope. We've got a final question, and I'm going to address it to John, actually, and it comes from Penny in the Greater Manchester Group. It's, John, what do you think the effect of the imprisonment and ordeal of Julian Assange has had on journalists and journalism? Has it made them more fearful over this period?
Well, I think it's bound to have had a chilling effect on those journalists that are interested in holding governments and corporations to account. Now, to be honest, and I speak as a member of the National Union of Journalists myself, that's not all journalists. But if you are a journalist who wants to do those things, then this case cannot but have a inhibiting effect on you. As many of the witnesses actually, and Apsana knows this from coming down to the hearings herself, many of the witnesses in the hearing for the defence made the point that what Julian Assange did in terms of talking to Chelsea Manning and printing what his source told him, or causing to be published what his source told him, is what any decent journalist does. It's absolutely impossible to separate out that business from the ordinary business of journalism, as if it was some kind of, sort of a secret, devious business where you ask a source to give you material and put it in the public domain. That is the definition of what investigative journalism certainly is about. And of course, this is the reason why the Obama administration halted the proceedings in the United States, the so-called New York Times problem, that if they were going to prosecute Julian Assange, they would have to prosecute the New York Times for publishing the material. And we could add in this country The Guardian, or in other countries El País, or and Le Monde, and so forth. So major news outlets, Der Spiegel in Germany, major news outlets in practically every country printed this material. And if Julian Assange is guilty of something, they are also guilty of something. And I guess that shows you, it shows you, number one, why the United States is doing this. They're doing it because, as the old phrase has it, you shoot one in order to encourage the others. They don't want to take on the mainstream media. They want to shoot somebody they can in order to discipline the mainstream media and other journalists. So that's precisely the function of this kind of prosecution.
Thanks very much for that, John. And I'd like to thank the rest of the panel. I'm just going to quickly sum up the meeting today and share a few words. So we've discussed a lot about the case and how it's going to progress forward, but I think it's also important to think about the personal aspect of this and the effect, as Lauri spoke about, of what Julian's going through on his mental health, and the mental health of his family, his partner Stella, their children. And it's really important to remember that Julian's a father who is missing seeing his children grow up. It's important to remember that Stella's waiting to have her partner return to her. That it's a travesty that he's still there, committing no crime, kept away from his family. And we've experienced a little bit of what Julian's gone through in lockdown. We're locked in the house. We're here. We're talking about a mental health crisis that's swinging across the country. We're all devastated if our delivery is 10 minutes late. But Julian has been putting up with this for years to the most extreme level. Whatever Julian's experiencing is 100%. We're experiencing 5% of that, and that is causing a huge mental health crisis in the country. And he's been going through it for years and years and years. So if you can take a tiny bit of what of the stress that you feel at the moment and magnify that by 100, you may start to imagine what Julian's going through. So I think it's really important that we think about that. And I think it's also important that we look at the current political climate. This false choice that we were presented with when it comes to parliamentary politics between neoliberalism and conservatism. There is another choice, because both of those things represent a race to war. Both of those things represent a very recent history, a very brutal war, one which tries to cover it with a facade of liberalism, but again does exactly the same thing, and the bombs hurt just as badly as they would if it didn't have that facade of liberalism. And so I think it's important that not only do we fight for Julian, but we fight for an alternative politics to what we've been presented with, this false dichotomy of neoliberalism versus conservatism does not exist. There is an alternative, and for a while Jeremy Corbyn represented that alternative, and that's why it was such a bitter fight to remove him from the Labour Party. But we must fight to keep his politics alive. So thank you all for joining the Stop the War with us today.
Can I add something very quickly?
I'm not going to. I'll bring you back in for a sorry, Lauri. Lauri. We need to wrap up.
Yeah. No.
I was going to sum up about the action that you can take, but I think John did that perfectly, so I'm not going to repeat that. Jump on the Don't Extradite Assange website, because that is the best source of information that you'll find. And if you're here and you're not a member of Stop the War, please go to the Stop the War website and register to join and get in touch with us. Because we have lots of activity going on locally, and we'd love you to get involved. Okay, thank you everybody.